My name is Jan Voigt, and I'm assisting with this conference for the Minnesota Association of Watershed Districts. And we're going to start with a welcome by Emily.
Hi, my name is Emily Javins, the Executive Director of MAUD, and I am here today to welcome you to the Watershed Management course. This is a popular course that's offered every year when we meet in person. Last year we did not offer this course. Instead, we completely focused on ways that you can finance your watershed projects without the general levy. That was a great collection of presentations. Those are still available online if you'd like to go back and watch those. And today will be recorded so that particularly if new managers join a board, that they will have access to some of the introductory lessons that are important for you to know when you start out as a watershed manager. I would say that most people, when they attend as a seasoned board member, they also pick up some tips and tricks. And so don't worry, you're not in the wrong class if you aren't brand new. We would welcome hearing your experiences and making that more interesting and a little more, just providing more feedback about what it is really like to be a member. So share those experiences and make the class as interactive as you can. A couple of announcements. Tomorrow we are going to start at 9 a.m. There will be presentations in the morning. And then at noon, we are going to have our awards ceremony. We are going to watch the movies that were produced by Watersheds this year. And then we're going to receive a presentation from prior learning. This is a new thing that we are offering this year. If you have registered 3 members to attend the conference this year, you will have access to 6,000 webinars that are of general nature. Some things like how to deal with difficult people, perhaps some accounting, how to run a meeting, things like that. So this is a nationwide education system. They do offer in-person courses, but they have built this huge library now of that work, and you will have access to that for registering. We're excited about that, and she is going to show us a little bit about exactly how that works and what is included. So make sure that you grab a lunch tomorrow and be there at noon. That is going to be a good hour to see the work of other watersheds and then learn about some new educational opportunities you will have from your association. And then at 4 o'clock tomorrow, there will be a social. We'll tell you more about that tomorrow, but don't block that. Don't erase that from your calendar. It's going to be fun. It will be online, but we're going to have a good time with that. Today, the workshop will end around 3 o'clock. And the important thing after that is that if you are a board member, you need to go to the regional caucus. So what happens at a regional caucus, if you haven't been to one before, is that there will be an election for the person that is going to represent you on the MAUD board of directors. There are 3 directors from each region. So it's a board of 9, and they rotate. So every year there is one person that is up for re-election. In the rural areas that are not in the Red River Valley, there are actually 2 because we did have an additional vacancy. The important thing, if you are from the rural area, if we don't get pretty much everyone at the meeting that registered as a delegate, you may be in jeopardy of having a quorum and will not be able to elect your member to be on the board of directors, and will need to find another time to do that. So please, please, please show up to those. We want to make sure that we have good attendance. You'll also be having a conversation about hot topics in your region, and then also filling out the positions for committees. And I just want to say those committees are vital to the work of MAUD. The committees study the issues a little bit more in depth and make recommendations to the MAUD board of directors. They are committees of 7. There's an administrator and a board member from each of the 3 regions, and then a chair that is typically a member of the MAUD board of directors. So that work is critical. It doesn't take a ton of time on any of the committees. It's a couple meetings. Some of them are even just one meeting, but we want your input, and that is a direct route for you to give feedback to the MAUD board of directors about the direction that we should be going. So 4 o'clock, find your caucus. Region 1 if you're in the Red River Valley, Region 2 if you're in the rural areas that are not the Red River Valley, and then Region 3 are the metro organizations. Last, I just want to thank our sponsors for hanging in again another year online. This is not ideal for them, and they have supported us financially. And the 6 platinum sponsors that we have again this year are More Engineering, ISG, Houston Engineering, Bar Engineering, Stantec, and EOR. So a huge thank you to those companies for sponsoring, and they are putting on the social tomorrow night too. So if you get a chance, they each in our virtual room have an area that you can go to. Please visit those and say a nice thank you to them. They do provide a decent amount of revenue for associations. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jan Voigt. Please enjoy your day. I'm going to be in the other workshop with the drainage, but I hope to see you more in the next couple of days. Thank you.
All right. We are ready to start our day. And I was going to ask just if you're interested in participating here quickly, if you would just like to introduce yourself and say what you are hoping to get out of the day.
Should we start? I guess I can start. My name is Kurt Botner. I'm with the Sauk River Watershed District. And what I'm looking to gain today, I'm a new manager, so I'm looking to help build that base to be a better manager.
Wonderful.
My name is Doug Taves. I'm with the Comfort Lake Forest Lake Watershed District up Forest Lake area. I'm new manager, worked in nonprofits, so working in the open environment of government is very interesting and something I need to learn about.
Great.
This is Arun Hechmari, and I'm with Minnehaha Creek Watershed District. And I'm a manager for about 3 years, but I know there's always more to learn. And I'm really grateful that Maud has put this on. So I hope to learn a lot. Thank you so much.
I'm Mary Texer. I'm with the Capital Region Watershed District, and I just needed a refresher course.
I'm Tina Karstens. I'm the administrator of the Ramsey Washington Metro Watershed District, and I'm looking forward to just listening in today so I can know what I can share with my managers in the future.
Hi, I'm Dawn Cole. I'm a manager with the Clearwater River Watershed District. I can never get that all out in one breath. I'm here to soak up whatever I can.
Ross Amundsen, new manager in the North Fork Crow River Watershed District. Just hoping to get a better handle on what I'm doing.
Wonderful. Anyone else?
Hi, Sean Murphy with Capital Region Watershed District. This is my third go around, so just looking for a refresher.
Great.
Hi, I'm Liz Forbes. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I'm Peggy Kvam, and I'm a one-year manager with the Nine Creek Watershed District. I've heard really good things about this training, so I'm looking forward to getting it now. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Rick Sanders, Capital Regions, and I'm here for a refresher course.
Guess I'll go. I'm Liz Forbes. I'm with the Riley Purgatory Bluff Creek Watershed District. I've been with the district about 7 months now, and I'm just happy to be here and learn a lot today.
Hello, I'm Dave Bakke from Scandia, Minnesota in the Comfort Lake Forest Lake Watershed District. I too am a new manager and looking forward to the day. Thanks.
All right. With that, then I guess I can turn it over to Lewis and Kevin. And you guys could maybe just give a short introduction of yourselves and then get right into your role in watershed management.
Well, I'll go first. Good morning, everyone. I'm Lewis Smith. I've had the privilege of attending MAUD for, I think, about 30 years and have been practicing watershed law for about 34. So it's amazing because I'm only 29 years old. But I have really found great meaning in working with watershed districts and am always fascinated with the people who decide to serve. You are all contributing a great deal of time and effort, and will probably undergo a fair amount of stress. So my hope is that by attending MAUD and participating in this workshop as well as others, you'll feel like you're gaining some tools, some ways to pursue your mission more effectively, a good understanding of the context in which you're working, how you're collaborating with other agencies, others working on the landscape to pursue your mission. So I'll look forward to spending time with you today, and I'll pass it over to Kevin.
Well, thanks, Lewis, and thanks, Jan. I'm Kevin Bigalke. I'm the Assistant Director for Regional Operations with the Board of Water and Soil Resources. I've been with Bowser about 5.5 years now, serving as both the Central Region Manager for about 2.5 or 3 years, and most recently in my role as Assistant Director. Prior to that, had worked with 2 different watershed districts, the Lower Minnesota River Watershed District for a couple of years as their first administrator, and then for about 10.5 or 11 years as the administrator for the 9 Mile Creek Watershed District. So got some experience as an administrator in terms of the insights of what goes into watershed district management, some board, what's really helpful from a board development standpoint, information sharing to make your jobs as board managers as easy as it can be, but more importantly, providing you with the tools that will make you the most effective manager that you can be, and be confident in your decisions and the direction that you'll be setting your individual watershed districts on, and making sure you're understanding all of the authorities that you actually have, as well as the sort of the rules and the procedures that you need to follow to implement those authorities. So I think today you have I've been doing this training on and off for a number of years, and we've seen it evolve, but a lot of it comes down to a lot of the same context. And the value in this session is that we get a mix of new managers with experienced managers, and as you saw, some administrators as well. So you're able to really get some good feedback from each other, and I think that's the important, a valuable piece when we had this in person is the feedback and the interaction. And so I would encourage, even as maybe challenging as it might be in a virtual format, trying to be engaged and participate in conversations. Don't be afraid to ask questions, whether it's through the chat function or raising your hand, or maybe just, if you're not being seen or heard, don't be afraid to interrupt, because we want to make sure that those conversations and your questions are being asked, and that's the value of today. So I think you'll see some really good information. I know The first part, the way it'll work this morning is, Lewis will provide a lot of the legal context in terms of the powers and their purposes. And I'll be sort of filling in some of the practical aspects of how those powers and purposes fill in. So, and then Annie Felix-Gerth with Bowser and will be talking on later this morning on the approach for watershed management in Minnesota. So with that, Jan, I don't know if we want to have Lewis kick us off or if there's anything else you need from us.
I think we're ready to get right into it. So Louis, if you want to start, that would be awesome.
Louis, you're on mute.
Very good. Can you all see my screen? Yes? All right. I'm going to do one more thing here. So this morning, I'm going to begin by describing for you where watersheds and watershed districts come from and trace some of the background and history. And then specifically the Minnesota Watershed Act adopted by the legislature in 1955. We'll then spend some time discussing the purposes for which watershed districts may be formed and the legal powers and authorities that watershed districts have. Then our 7-county metropolitan area has its own Watershed Management Act, which was adopted by the legislature in 1982. I'll spend some time talking about that. And then finally, a few thoughts about your tools, how watershed districts have evolved, and some thoughts about governance. So I trace the idea of watersheds back to John Wesley Powell, who was a fascinating figure in our Western United States history. He was the, I believe, second director of the U.S. Geological Society. He explored many of the rivers, and his most famous adventure was of the Colorado River, where he did a lot of original mapping and tracking on behalf of European settlers coming across the landscape. His definition of a watershed was that area of land, a bounded hydrologic system within which all living things are inextricably linked by their common water course, and where, as humans settled, simple logic demanded that they become part of a community. I love that sense of how it is the hydrologic system that defines and connects all life and compels the idea of working together in community. John Wesley Powell developed several major reports for the United States Congress where he recommended that the Western United States, west of the Mississippi, the arid regions, be organized by hydrographic basins. You see this map he presented of the large river basins of the West, and it was his vision that instead of our state boundaries, which were essentially political lines or to be drawn, that we would organize within basins, and that natural resources and water in particular would be managed within those basins. He foresaw an era where we would excessively over-irrigate for purposes of agriculture or mining, and that would cause all kinds of problems in terms of the sustainability of our resources and our economies. In many ways, he foreshadowed a lot of the water problems we now have in the Western United States. And his report was largely ignored by the Congress which opted to kind of go with a way of organization and the land settlement patterns that were led largely by the mining and railroad interests. But I think the wisdom of organizing by watershed is an idea he left with us that you'll see we've adopted in Minnesota. The other piece of this was he really emphasized local self-government and these watershed commonwealths being largely independent communities that are, again, defined by a watershed basis. If you look at Minnesota, you see that we have our county boundaries, our 87 counties, but this shows you 87 watersheds that might have been an alternative way for us to organize Minnesota. What we're now experiencing and have done is overlaid watershed organizations on top of those county boundaries, and that makes life much more rich and exciting. The 1955 legislature really was on the forefront nationally, and Raymond Hake, who's pictured here, a mentor of mine and an attorney, kind of the original watershed attorney, was key player in drafting the Watershed Act of 1955. And the legislature was responding to several important problems or drivers when it considered this legislation. One was, by the mid-1950s, we were seeing in our metropolitan area and in other urbanizing areas throughout the state, the incentive that municipalities had to maximize the development, build their tax base to pay for public services. What that also meant, though, was maximizing hard surface and pavement, which tended to create flooding problems for those communities downstream. So the dynamic of maximizing your development and pushing your water problems to the downstream community created this notion that we should try to manage water problems within the hydrologic basin, within the watershed, and not just by municipal boundaries. There also were not only concerns with flooding problems, but some leading conservation organizations, including the Isaac Walton League, were advocating strongly for the creation of watershed districts to address problems they saw with the draining of wetlands and the loss of water and wetland habitat. So this led the legislature to adopt this very innovative act. There is really no other state in the union that has anything quite like watershed districts in Minnesota. In Florida, there are 5 large regional water management districts that operate at a much different scale, have important authorities. In the West, there are various kinds of water management districts focused on irrigation and water supply, but not with the same kind of powers and purposes that we have for watershed districts in Minnesota. So the Watershed Act in Minnesota created this new special purpose unit of government that has limited select powers. Watershed districts are only formed where they are wanted by petition of local units of government or citizens. They're governed, as you all know, by an independent citizen board that is appointed by county boards, not elected independently. Watershed districts were given broad regulatory authority over land use as it impacts water resources, the authority to finance water resource improvement projects, and to do so with property tax levies or other special assessments on benefited lands. So again, a very unique set of authorities that the legislature provided for watershed districts. So this map shows you where watershed districts exist here, where they've been petitioned and established. You see that the Red River Valley is rich with watershed districts. I would say that flooding problems are a big motivator for establishing watershed districts in the Red River Valley. You see that northeastern Minnesota, the Arrowhead region, has no watershed districts. And otherwise, central Minnesota and southern Minnesota in select agricultural areas have watershed districts. The metro is its own story. We'll say a little bit more when we get to the Metro Surface Water Management Act of 1982, but we have, as you see the inset map there, 14 watershed districts that were created, petitioned for, and created within the metro area. So we'll turn now to a review of the purposes and powers of watershed districts. These are your main understanding of the tools that you have as a watershed district authority. As we do this, remember, this reflects largely a 1955 understanding of water resources. You'll see some provisions that are still in the statutes, but have really become overtaken by other concepts of how we, for example, consider wetlands. It is important also to remember that watershed districts do not have broad police powers of municipalities, townships, counties, but only these special purposes that the legislature has given to watershed districts. It's a long list of purposes for which watershed districts may be created. I have categorized them into three categories: the protection of water resources, improvement of water resources, and what I call provision, or provision of water supply or hydroelectric power. One other important thing to remember is that watershed districts do not have authority over zoning or land use planning. That is truly a sovereign authority of local government, municipalities, townships, counties. And also watershed districts do not have authority over surface water use. So regulation of boating activities, for example. So let's begin with the list of purposes for which a watershed district may be created that fall in this protection category. A number one purpose for watershed districts is to control or alleviate damage from floodwaters. Flood protection is a major motivation for the whole Watershed Act and for why watershed districts are created. Another purpose is to regulate the flow of streams and conserve the stream's water. This is an interesting dynamic in the Western United States. As you saw that map, and as you may know from traveling out west, water scarcity is a major problem. And the way water law emerged in the Western United States was what they called prior appropriation, which is basically first come, first served. You established your water rights by your seniority in how you use the water, and it created a motivation to maximize the use of the water and ultimately deplete the streams. And so various states around the country, including Minnesota, adopted statutes to preserve the flow of streams and conserve the water. Another purpose is to provide for sanitation and public health and regulate the use of streams, ditches, and watercourses to dispose of waste. The fact of our history is that until even 1970s, many of our water bodies were used as sinks for disposal of waste, either our rivers or lakes. Lake Minnetonka, for example, it wasn't until the early 1970s that we stopped the practice of discharging sewage waste directly into the lake. So this is a purpose for which watershed districts may be formed to protect public health and regulate the use of streams for disposal of waste. Erosion is another major watershed concern, and controlling or alleviating soil erosion and siltation in watercourses, water basins, a major purpose for watershed districts. It's erosion that causes a lot of harm to the landscape and to water bodies. Also, the authority to regulate improvements by riparian property owners, those property owners who own land adjacent to lakes, streams, so as to protect the lake beds, the banks, and shores of lakes, streams, and wetlands for preservation and beneficial public use. Also, to protect or enhance water quality. Water quality really became a legal concern ultimately for most of the United States with the Clean Water Act in 1972. And some states adopted some protections for water quality a bit earlier than that. Here, Minnesota's 1955 Watershed Act really stands out again in terms of identifying water quality protection as an important purpose for creating a watershed district. Groundwater protection and regulation of use of groundwater to preserve it for beneficial purposes, also a very important authority for watershed districts. You know, for many years, we operated with the idea that groundwater was invisible. It must be an endless resource. We've learned more recently with what's happened at White Bear Lake and other places that groundwater is a limited, precious resource, and watershed districts have authority to address protection of groundwater. So that's the list of protection purposes. We turn now to purposes for which watershed districts could be created to improve water resources. And one of those was to essentially provide for dredging of stream channels, to provide for drainage, navigation, or other public purposes. Dredging of stream channels has been subject to a great deal more regulation now by first the DNR and other and even watershed districts. We no longer have generally followed the practice of straightening streams to facilitate drainage or land development. Similarly, watershed districts in 1955 could be created to reclaim or fill wet and overflowed land. The Wetland Conservation Act has overtaken that purpose. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with the Wetland Conservation Act. Watershed districts could be created for the purpose of diverting or changing all or part of watercourses. Again, the older idea of diverting or straightening streams for other purposes of management. Also, watershed districts have the authority to manage drainage systems within the watershed district. And so the repair, improvement, relocation, modification, consolidation, or abandonment of drainage systems fit within the purposes for which a watershed district may be created.
Louis, I might jump in here real quick while you're on that
Thank
point.
you,
Just to give a sense of the diversity that the watershed districts in Minnesota do cover. You know, the drainage piece specific to navigation is a unique one, and we do actually have a watershed district that was established for that purpose. The Lower Minnesota River Watershed District, when its initial purpose was to serve as the local sponsor to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to maintain the navigation channel on the Minnesota River. And so part of their initial task and responsibility was to work with the surrounding communities and the businesses to provide storage sites for the dredge material as the Corps dredged it out for navigation purposes. And they still perform that function today. but they've also expanded as watershed district purposes have evolved. The watershed, Lower Minnesota Watershed District has as well, encompassing more of the broader responsibilities of a watershed district beyond just the navigation channel. But we do have one instance where that was their purpose, is to work with the Corps of Engineers on navigation purposes.
Thanks, Kevin. That's a really helpful insight, and it really underscores the point that watershed districts are not all alike and have embraced these purposes in different ways depending on the needs of the local landscape and local water resources. In this category of provision, water supply is one of the purposes for which watershed districts may be created, for water supply for irrigation or for domestic, industrial, recreational, agricultural, other public uses. And so that is a very interesting authority or purpose for a watershed district, as well as to provide for hydroelectric power generation. And these are, I believe there are 1 or 2 watershed districts that have used these authorities. What's interesting and what this underscores is that the legislature in 1955 really looked across the United States at all the different kinds of water management organizations that existed and really sought to bring every conceivable authority at the time to local water management in Minnesota. So very, very specialized authority as to water resources, but very broad in terms of every kind of water authority you might think of. So I'd like to turn from the purposes for which a watershed district may be created to the specific list of powers that the Board of Managers is given by statute. And you'll see that there's a correlation between these. We begin with noting that even though watershed districts are a special purpose unit of government, you have authority to exercise powers that are necessary and proper to address all this list of powers and authorities that I'm going to describe for you, and to the extent necessary for lawful conservation purposes. The exercise of authority by watershed districts is subject to review both by courts and in some cases by the Minnesota Board of Water and Soil Resources, which is provided in statute. So watershed districts have many of the important powers of local units of government: to sue and be sued, to incur debt, and issue bond debt, to exercise eminent domain, or to otherwise acquire property by gift or purchase. So watershed districts have exercised the authority of eminent domain. It can be at times controversial, and we counsel that it be exercised with due care and careful attention to the taking of property only as is necessary to effect a public purpose. And any such taking, of course, requires legally that there be just compensation. But those are powerful tools for watershed districts in terms of pursuing your purposes. Watershed districts have the authority to enter into joint powers agreements with other units of government, other watershed districts or cities or counties, to acquire and dispose of property from state and federal agencies, to make necessary use of surveys and gather hydrologic data, to cooperate or contract with both governmental or non-governmental agencies, to perform work in ditches and water courses, to acquire, operate, construct, and maintain water control works, again, going to that water supply authority that or purpose for which watershed districts may be created. to conserve and control the use of water within the watershed district. So there are some limited ways in which I think watershed districts have already started to explore this power. But if we think of the wide swings in precipitation patterns and the increase of drought and the imperative of conservation of water, it will be interesting to see if watershed districts are invited to play a larger role using this authority to control the use of water within a watershed district. Right now, it is largely your municipality that restricts when you can water your lawn on, in my case of my city, odd numbered days for odd numbered residents. But it may be some case where watershed districts are called upon to look at adopting conservation measures and controlling the use of water. You're legally authorized to acquire insurance to protect your interests, to enter into construction contracts. The Watershed Act gives watershed districts specific authority to enter lands either inside or outside the watershed district to make surveys and investigations to accomplish your watershed district purposes. So several points I would make about this power. Number one, you're always well advised to exercise good courtesy and provide notice to landowners that you're coming on to their land and the purpose for which you're doing that. You are also liable for any damage that you cause in terms of gathering data. So if soil borings would to get out of hand and cause damage, that's an issue for which watershed districts would be liable. But this is an explicit recognition of the need for watershed districts to go out onto the landscape to do surveys and gather information. Going back to some of the purposes we saw for water quality and protection of public health, to provide for sanitation and pollution prevention, and regulate the use of streams, ditches, or watercourses to dispose of waste and to prevent pollution. So again, an important legal authority of watershed districts. Also a borrowing authority. Watershed districts have authority to borrow money from government agencies or financial institutions. And if a watershed district is borrowing from a county or a financial institution under Chapter 103D, there's a $2 million limit to that loan authority. There are other provisions in the law that may provide a way for issuing bonded debt in excess of that amount, but that is one loan limitation to see in the statute. Watershed districts have the authority to prepare floodplain maps of the lands located within the watershed district in the floodplain, and to control land use and development in the floodplain, green belt, and open space areas of the watershed district in the absence of county or municipal ordinances regulating those issues. So again, authority to regulate land use as it impacts water resources found here in this provision of 103D. Have specific authority to join MAUD, the Association of Watershed Districts, and to contract with other bodies for cooperation and assistance, to pursue projects in other states for watershed districts on our state borders. This can be an important authority. There is important cooperation in the Red River Valley with our neighbors in North Dakota and even Manitoba. We also have authority to engage in water resource management activities, to conduct studies and monitor water resources within the watershed and implement management programs. So again, you'll see the legislature gave watershed districts just about every power and authority you could think of as it relates to water with just a few exceptions. Also should note that the Metropolitan Water Management Act gave metropolitan watershed districts additional authority to regulate land use and development of land as it relates to a planning process whereby local municipalities must adopt local water plans that conform to the requirements of the watershed district plan. And in that process, watershed districts and cities work out with each other and cooperate which entity is going to regulate certain activity through permits in terms of stormwater management, erosion, dredging, those kinds of activities. So that's an additional layer of authority that metropolitan watershed districts have not found outside the 7-county metropolitan area. Watershed districts also are specifically mandated to adopt rules to accomplish the purposes of the watershed law and implement these powers. So each watershed district has rules. It's really the key vehicle for which your permitting program or regulatory authority is exercised. We can speak more about rulemaking, the rulemaking process, and regulating activity on the landscape. This is just one tool in your toolbox for addressing problems in your watershed. Also, the Watershed Act provides for your annual adoption of a budget and certification of your levies to your county or counties where your watershed district is located. This must happen under the watershed law by September 15th of each year. And there are additional requirements from the truth in taxation law that applies to all local units of government. And those provisions require that you hold an additional informational meeting in either late November, early December, to allow the public an additional opportunity to comment on your budget and levy. And you have authority, if you wish, to change your levy in December before the county auditors set the levies for good for the year. It's recommended that you only decrease your levy, not increase it after September 15th.
Louis, I might add in a couple of things here from a practical standpoint. I mean, these are the things that the base bare minimum of what you need to do. You need to have that budget certified, and have that done by September 15th, and that's done through the hearing process, and then obviously the informational meeting. But a lot goes into your budget development before you get to your board decision to adopt your budget prior to September 15th. And typically that's going to start, at some point early to midsummer. You might have some board workshops. Your administrator might be developing some budget ideas to share with you as a board as you're leading into that. One of the things that that in my experience, when I was in particular at 9 Mile, that we did is we usually ended up having at least one, if not two, budget workshops in July or in July and August. Those are open to the public, just like a regular board meeting would, but it allows the board to have a discussion about where do you want to go in terms of a budget? What sort of projects do you want to take on? Are you anticipating? And having that in a public forum so that there can be conversation about it. And that makes it might seem like it's some added steps, but I think it really adds value into the buy-in of the board, that you understand what the budget is before it gets to your hearing when you adopt your budget. And I think that's an important piece to keep in mind, because as you are out as managers, maybe talking with your county commissioners, talking with city representatives, talking with your constituents, and they have a question on your budget, it really helps to be have a grasp and an understanding of what actually is in that budget, and that it wasn't just developed by a staff person and they presented it and it was adopted in one meeting. You've had a series of meetings, you really invested time in looking at it. In particular, when it goes to certifying that to the county, if the county commissioners tend to have, if they have any questions about an adjustment to your levy, what it's previously been, an increase, maybe a significant project that you're taking on, you're really informed about it. But that pre-work going into it is important to make sure that you're doing that in a public setting, and that you have that conversation before you get to the adoption hearing.
Thanks, Kevin. It probably is, it is one of the most important functions you play as a manager on a watershed board, is to be a part of the budget process, to understand your budget, so that you can be a part of communicating when there are questions. So I'm going to spend a moment on the 1982 Metropolitan Surface Water Management Planning Act. This was the chief author in the Minnesota Senate was Gene Merriam, senator from Anoka County, who also later became the commissioner of the DNR. This act came from several really important drivers that were affecting watershed districts, maybe especially in the metropolitan area. There had been several controversial watershed projects in watershed districts that had, in one case, 3 counties. And it was a lake restoration project, and property taxpayers from the other counties wondered why they should be paying property taxes to improve a lake in the 3rd county. So there was controversy. There also were questions about the merits of some of the projects watershed districts were doing. And so this led to Senator Merriam and Representative Connie Levi authoring this Watershed Planning Act. And the goals of this act were to develop a planning process so that watershed projects would be cost effective and could demonstrate their cost effectiveness, that there would be some sense of tax equity for watershed projects, and that the solution was comprehensive planning for the whole metropolitan area. So the act provided for several really important requirements. One is that there be a 10-year plan for every watershed organization in the metro area. And the idea is that if you go through a comprehensive assessment of your problems in your watershed, and in the long term identify projects that address those problems, you're going to operate much more cost effectively in doing your work. The act required that there be a water management organization of some kind throughout every part of the 7-county metropolitan area, either a watershed district or a joint powers water management organization, which is essentially municipalities by a joint powers agreement agreeing that they'll together manage a watershed area. And this really reflected the legislature's recognition of the importance of watershed management, but also this balance of authority and tension of authority between watershed districts and municipalities. And so one of the ways that the legislature addressed that tension was to provide an option for municipalities to not have a watershed district if they wanted to, through a joint powers agreement, manage the watershed directly by city appointees and city direct budget contributions. So the result is that either from the statewide Watershed Act or the Surface Water Planning Act for the metro area coming in 1982, all of your tools and authorities boil down to kind of three broad areas. You can build capital improvement projects that are designed to address problems in your landscape with flooding or water quality. You can adopt regulations to regulate activity on the landscape that impacts water resources, or you can adopt programs of education of the public to change certain practices voluntarily. And I think one of the key ways you exercise your authority as a watershed manager, keeping in mind these different tools, is to think about which tool is appropriate. Not every problem on your landscape is best addressed through regulation. And not every problem is best addressed through a capital project. Some are best addressed by educating the public so that voluntarily people change practices over time or adopt with some incentives certain practices to improve water resources. I think we've had enough experience now since 1955 to see how watershed districts have operated and have evolved over time. And I would say many watershed districts were formed initially to address flooding problems. But over time, water quality also has become a concern. And we saw that watershed districts would pursue projects to create regional ponds to treat stormwater and improve water quality, or this Clean Water Act tool called Total Maximum Daily Load. It's a formula for assessing an impaired water, identifying the pollution that's loading and how to reduce that load, and put the pollution on a diet to get back to a level that meets water quality standards. Watershed districts have been an important part of that part of water quality work. But also then we evolved to a point of understanding that the volume of stormwater is an important impact on the landscape and to water resources, not just the rate of control of a stormwater flow. So many watershed districts started to pursue volume control regulations to address that issue. Some watershed districts decided that they could also pursue their mission by acquiring land and conserving it to protect critical habitat, critical fringe wetlands, critical lands that impact water resources for either restoring degraded landscapes or protecting them in a natural state. Ultimately, this has led to the idea that to be effective, watershed districts need to work in partnership with those who are also working on the landscape, either through land use planning as a city, as developers who are pursuing the built environment. And this cooperative approach creates a balance and a much more opportunity to be effective doing your watershed work. And I think that leads me to the kind of parting notion that in water management, we have this kind of challenge of silos where we are isolated within our own agency. There are many, many agencies of government, state, federal, regional, local government that are touching some aspect of water problems. And it's important that we gain awareness of what all of those other agencies and partners are up to so that we can work rather in partnership rather than in isolation. So with that, let me see if you have any questions.
I guess I have a question. I'm looking at the purpose of the watersheds and that this, I'm just thinking, do the watersheds bump up against all the other government agencies? It seems like there's a lot of agencies kind of with the same basic purpose. So do they compete against each other?
That's a great question, Manager. Was it Manager Botner that asked it?
Yeah.
Thank you. You know, the story of water management in Minnesota involves a lot of conflict. Even within my 30-some years of experience, I can recall examples where watershed districts felt like they were in competition with other entities to be the water management authority. And there are some of those conflicts that still surface even now. I think that one of the things we've discovered over time is that actually about every 10 years, a governor will propose to reorganize water management in Minnesota. I've got a whole file drawer full of those studies that propose in some ways, why do we have a pollution control agency and a DNR? They should be combined. Why do we have a board of water and soil resources? Put them all together in a single state agency. Why do we have soil and water conservation districts and watershed districts? They should be combined. And there certainly are some cities that wish that they didn't have a watershed district in their neighborhood. But the fact of the matter is, when you get into those conversations and work through all the different conflicts, you start to discover there's a role for everyone. And the best way to go about this is collaboration and coordination. So we're not duplicating each other's efforts. So we can adopt maybe a one-stop shop for permitting so that someone pursuing a water permit doesn't need to run around to 3 different agencies when the permitting could be coordinated through one. A very important development was our local government roundtable, where the Association of Minnesota Counties, the League of Minnesota Cities, the Minnesota Association of Watershed Districts, and the Soil and Water Conservation Districts all got together and discussed how we could coordinate and develop this one watershed, one plan initiative that Bowser is leading. So I think Kevin is going to have a lot to say about this also, but to be involved in water is to experience conflict. It wasn't Mark Twain that said whiskey's for drinking and water's for fight. So given the nature of water, problems with flooding,
That's my
with
internet
water
connection
quality,
is unstable.
we are, I think, all going to see conflict. And there will be some sense of competition over authority, but the best outcome is to get to understand each other's authority, what tools other agencies have. What's unique about watershed districts is that it's local. You're defined by hydrologic local water basin. You have managers who are appointed, not elected, that have an understanding of the local landscape. And then you have this unique set of tools and authorities. So it's important that you exercise those authorities, understanding the importance of coordination with others and playing well with others. Let me pass it over to Kevin.
Yeah, well said, Louis. And I think just to build off that, I think the important part is identifying that there's, like Louis said, there's a role within each sort of unit of government in terms of what their purposes are. There might be some overlap in terms of objectives and goals and what each entity is trying to accomplish. And so maybe that you get into some discussion about who's going to lead that effort. So if you have, a watershed district, a county, an SWCD, and maybe, DNR doing some stream work or pollution control agency doing some work, if it's all within that same watershed and you all have the same or common goal and approach to address that water resource, there might be some discussion and conflict about who has the better approach, who has the right idea, who's going to lead that effort. I think one of the things that, as Lewis mentioned with the local government water roundtable, and as Annie will get into in the next presentation with the watershed planning or water management approach in Minnesota with one watershed, one plan and comprehensive watershed management, is identifying those uniform goals and those highest priority efforts within watersheds among multiple units of government, and identifying how those are jointly going to be implemented to achieve water quality. I think the other aspect is that there is a purpose and a role for each agency. At the state level, you tend to be providing broader statewide goals and strategies and approaches for statewide water resources. You have the state impaired waters and TMDLs, lots of other goals and efforts put forth that identify on a statewide basis. If you want to go in the metro with the Metropolitan Council, some regional planning and approaches, and then the local government level where the watershed districts and counties and SWCDs and municipalities come into play. And, through that collaborative approach is where the success comes into play. And yeah, I think there's certainly some conflict occasionally, but I think through that conflict is where you find your best approaches and those unique partnerships and opportunities. So it's part of a complex web of responsibilities and authorities. It's all incumbent on us to figure out how to weave through that and maneuver it for the success of our resources.
Well, Annie, I think I'm ready to pass the baton over to you.
Sounds good, Lewis. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Lewis really kicked us off here with some great information about the basics of watershed districts here in Minnesota. What I'm going to do here today is kind of leapfrog off of what he spoke about and get a little bit more into the nitty-gritty about Minnesota's watershed approach. A lot of what Lewis talked about is going to be sprinkled in here as well. So we're going to bring up some of those topics again and dive into a little bit more depth. So I'm going to share my screen here, which always is a fun thing to try to make the technology work. Let's see, let's do that one. Get this going. And then I got to flip, I think. All right, so hopefully you should be seeing my presentation now. Does it look good?
Yes.
All right. So my name's Annie Felix-Gerth. I'm with the Board of Water and Soil Resources. I am the water programs coordinator. I work with Kevin and other folks in the regional operations section of Bowser. I've been a Bowser for a little over 4 years now, working with this program. Part of my responsibilities is to provide some of the procedural and process support for folks like watershed districts and soil water conservation districts, water management organizations here in Minnesota. But I also work with the other agencies on water management and collaboration at the state agency level. And groundwater is also one of the things that I focus on. So today's presentation, like I said, is going to focus mostly on our approach here in Minnesota, and we'll wrap in some of the things that Lewis talked about. So I don't think that these pictures here on the screen would be too unfamiliar to you all if you've been in the water world and focusing on water management here in Minnesota. It's some of the issues that we come up against, right? When we talk about water concerns and water management issues. I'm sure that some of these might actually occur in your watershed here. We've got some drinking water contamination issues pictured, flooding. Lewis talked a lot about why watershed districts were originally established in the first place, was to deal with flooding. We got a picture here, the Minnesota and Mississippi River confluence, where we got sedimentation occurring. And then lastly, White Bear Lake and the issue of lack of water, right? Water quantity issues. So These types of issues can obviously affect people's health, their livelihood, and safety. And so these are the things that as managers of watershed districts, you're a part of this solution, right? And the districts are really established to address all these. So Lewis did a great job of walking us through what the purpose of the watershed districts and when they originated. I'm going to actually step a little bit farther back in time and talk a little bit how our water governance management started here in Minnesota, just so you can get a real good perspective, a comprehensive perspective on really how things all come together. I think one of the managers here brought up, how do we all keep working within kind of our bubble, but then coordinating with others. And so we'll start with kind of all the different agencies and entities here, and then we're going to start to see how we can collaborate together. So you can see here at the very left part of the timeline, you see the soil conservation law, which have actually allowed for the formation of soil water conservation districts back in 1937. And that was in response to what we all know as the Dust Bowl era, right? Not enough water. And then Lewis talked about the 1955 Watershed Act that was due in part to too much water. And that allowed for Minnesota's first watershed district to form in 1957. And then the Clean Water Act was a federal act that occurred in 1972. That was in response to dirty water. And we wanted to have fishable and swimmable waters. And the goal of that was to be fishable and swimmable by 1983. But we all know that we're still working on that, right? That's a never-ending goal there. And then in the 1980s, Lewis talked about the 1982 Surface Water Management Act here in the Metro, and that was in an attempt to have cities and water management entities work together in collaboration. And then finally, we see here on the bottom right is the County Water Management Act, which allowed counties to link planning to state funding. So this was kind of the first era, I would say, of water management here in Minnesota. And you can see that's already established quite a few different entities, your soil and water conservation districts, you as watershed districts, and then we've got water management organizations in the Metro. So we're going to move to the next era here with the rest of the timeline, and we get into the 2000s. And you'll see here in the early 2000s, we got a lot happening here that starts with clean water, right? So we had a major national trend at the time, and Minnesota followed that trend as well. And the approach was to go towards watershed management. And so it started with the Clean Water Legacy Act in 2006, and then the amendment, the Legacy Amendment, which passed in 2008, and that provided the authority and the direction and the resources to achieve our water quality standards. And then the revenue, the amendment actually provided the revenue to help accomplish that. So I hope that some of you or most of you are familiar with the Clean Water Legacy Act and the Clean Water Amendment. Those are really key to the work that we're doing here in Minnesota. In 2010 or so, Lewis talked a little bit about the roundtable, local government water roundtable. And again, that was made up of soil and water conservation districts, counties, and watershed districts. They got together and put together a policy paper on recommendations for future water management. And we'll talk a little bit about that here in the next slide, because it really leads us to kind of the meat of our discussion today. Then in 2012, there was legislation to start what we call now the One Watershed, One Plan program, or coordinated local water management. And we'll talk about that here after this more in depth. And then 2013, the Clean Water Accountability Act, which you can see has a lot of signatories on that to help provide accountability to this new funding. 2013 was legislation that solidified this One Watershed, One Plan program. And then finally, around 2017, we had this pilot at the Board of Water and Soil Resources to do watershed-based implementation funding. And then in 2019, that becomes an official program. So we'll talk a little bit about that here at the end of our program today. I think others will be talking more in depth about that here, so I won't spend a lot of time. But again, this is kind of the era that really transitioned us to this watershed approach and watershed management. So here's a little bit more about what happened in 2013 with this paper that came from the local water government roundtable. Folks from these three groups came together and provided really an approach and some recommendations for how water management should occur in the future in Minnesota. There were three major recommendations, and we're going to spend time kind of diving into each of these three in the subsequent slides. But the first one is scale. There was, as you can tell, from our timeline, we had all different scales of management occurring here in Minnesota, and so we want to have some consistency on scale, and so we'll talk a little bit about that. Streamlining was a big one. These groups really wanted to see streamlining both in the statutory obligations and the programs that the state administered. And so we'll talk a little bit how that has occurred here at post 2013. And then finally, funding that was predictable and equitable across the state. And so that is the notion of the watershed-based implementation funding, which we'll talk about here at the end of presentation. So here you'll see the logo of the One Watershed, One Plan program here at Bowser. On the right, you'll see this map, which is a suggested boundary map for the program. The scale is based on the major watersheds, so you'll see those broken out here. Bowser created this suggested boundary map as kind of a discussion point for the watersheds that are contained within them. Currently, there's around 61, and there's 2 in the metro. These boundary lines can be modified by the partners who are working within that watershed, and they often do get discussed during the onset of the planning process and are fully defined during that time. So this is kind of, like I said, this is a dynamic process that's going on even as we speak on these boundaries. Of the 61 that you see here, nearly half of them have either gone through the planning process or have completed the planning process. So we're about halfway through, which is on target for our goal. So here we go. Here's the 3 entities that Lewis and I have talked about here in our presentation so far. We have the soil and water conservation districts, the counties, and the watershed districts. And you can see they all have potentially a little different boundaries. Counties and soil and waters are orientated around their jurisdictional boundaries. And again, watershed districts are orientated around their hydraulic boundaries. So prior to 2012, we had these 3 entities working within their own authorities and powers, and all doing individual plans, water resource plans. Soil and waters have soil and water conservation comprehensive plans. Counties have the county water plans, and the watershed districts had their watershed plans. So each of them, like I said, had their own boards, had their own plans, and they're all operating at their jurisdictional level. The issue was that in some cases you had multiple plans for maybe the same parcel of ground. So let's just take, for example, Kitson County there up in the very northwest part of Minnesota. They could have had 4 plans. One could have been the soil and water conservation comprehensive plan, the Kitson County water plan, and then you can see the Joe River watershed and the Two Rivers watershed occur both in that watershed as well. So you could have had 4 plans. You can see how this can be potentially redundant and duplicative. And so this whole One Watershed, One Plan approach was really meant to utilize the entities that exist there, but also do that through one planning process. And so the 2012 legislation that we talked about earlier that I showed on the timeline was the local water management coordination legislation, also known as One Watershed, One Plan. And the statutory number is 103B.101 subdivision 14. So this allows for Bowser to adopt resolutions, policies, or orders that allow for a comprehensive plan, a local water management plan, or a watershed management plan to be adopted, amended, or approved, or to serve as substitutes for each other, or be replaced with a comprehensive watershed management plan, which is done through the One Watershed, One Plan program. So the next recommendation from the paper after scale was streamlining. And the one thing that was really key to streamlining, as you can probably already tell, is the partners that are involved in planning. We had the three major partners, the soil and water conservation districts, the counties, the watershed districts, all operating in some places right near or on top of each other. And so how can we get those entities to collaborate and cooperate together to do shared vision and goals? So the biggest challenge here is the who is involved, right? And who's going to be involved in the planning and the implementation. So the One Watershed, One Plan program is really a collaborative and coordinated effort in water planning. And I think Louis really hit on that at the end of his presentation. I don't think we can really emphasize enough that the new era of watershed management really is about collaboration. And this is just a visual of what it looks like if you were to draw it out. Really, you've got the three entities here in the middle, each with their own bubble, but you can see they're conjoined at the very center. And what happens here is the folks who decide to get involved in the One Watershed, One Planning program do so voluntarily. Again, this is a voluntary effort that entities take on and decide to do. If they do decide to do it, there's equal participation by each member, and each entity maintains their individual local authorities. So again, they remain an individual, but yet they're working together. If the entities do decide to participate, the requirement is that at a minimum, they do the soil and water conservation districts in the area, the counties and the watershed districts do need to sit down together and create this shared vision and goals. This is challenging. And I think we talked about conflict and challenge and overcoming this. It's challenging when these entities maybe have never worked together in the past. And so at the first kind of stage of this, it's really forming those relationships and beginning to understand each other's powers, duties, and authorities, and really what are the assets that they bring to the table. So a lot of the planning, at least at the beginning, is spent on really developing those relationships and establishing that trust. So the groups that you see on the outside of that big blue circle are generally advisory in the process. The cities and tribal entities are considered optional, but we do ask that the required participants invite them to be involved in the planning process. And it's up to the cities and tribes to decide whether or not they feel like that would be a valuable use of their time and a way to better coordinate the natural resources management in their area. We do have a few watersheds where this has occurred. In the St. Louis River watershed, the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior Chippewa tribe has joined the planning partnership. In the Cedar River watershed, the city of Austin has participated as a formal participant. In the Shell Rock and Winnebago River, the city of Albert Lee has participated. So these cities are participating mostly because of local concerns within their city jurisdiction that have to do with flooding or non-point source pollution. Usually there's a priority in their area that they want to address, and they feel this is a valid way to really approach that through this collaborative effort. So the idea here is that if you use your individual authorities, your expertise, and your resources together to collaborate, you'll be able to come up with something that works towards a common goal. So these efforts typically take around 2 years to complete the planning portion of this whole watershed management. And in some cases, sometimes shorter and sometimes longer. It just depends on, I think, a lot of times on the planning partnership itself and how long it takes to kind of get those relationships started if they haven't already been developed. So a little bit about streamlining the plan itself. So we just talked about streamlining the people that are involved and the collaboration that occurs there. And now I want to talk a little bit about the plan themselves. And I apologize, this is a very blurry slide. But really what it's trying to show here is there's a lot of information that goes into the plans. Not only do we incorporate the best science that we have available through the GRAPs and the RAPs, so that's the watershed restoration and protection strategies that are produced by the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, and the groundwater restoration and protection strategies, which are produced by all the state agencies in collaboration. They provide the science behind what we know in the watershed. So that gets brought into the planning discussion. And then in the cases where there is a total maximum daily load or a TMDL that's been established, that also gets brought into the discussion about how that's going to affect the outcomes and the goals. There's also this local knowledge of issues and just local knowledge of the resource itself that is a key part of these plans, that you as managers and as soil and water conservation district staff and professionals know about the water resources and know that best and the history, and that gets pulled into the plan as well. Finally, the citizens of the watershed bring forth the values and priorities that they want to see addressed in the plan. And then the entities that are involved have these financial commitments that are agreed to in order to implement the plan. And then there's joint agreement about who does what, where. So that's where this collaboration really is. If it's highly functioning, you can see how all the assets of the different partners are brought forward to really bring about maybe greater success than you could have had individually. And finally, these are locally adopted by all the entities involved. That's a choice, again, at the very end, whether or not the entity wants to locally adopt it. In the cases of watershed districts, you may adopt your comprehensive watershed management plan, but you also may keep all or a portion of your watershed district plan too, if that makes sense. And that's a discussion that you need to have amongst yourselves and the planning partnership to see what will make sense going forward in the future. So a little bit about the plans and how they're kind of the next step or evolution in Minnesota. During the planning process, the partnership really does need to address some key questions. And we do that through prioritizing what issues to work on and why. I think that's a real difficult, challenging question, because we've got all these competing interests and you've got all these collaborative partners working together. And so I think this piece just alone may take up a large part of the conversation, is where are we going to spend our time working? We know that if we make a concentrated effort in one area, we will bring about change eventually. And so where we want to work is really key. Next is where we want to focus our efforts. What activities do we want to put in which locations? What makes sense to do where? This is the targeting part of the conversation. A lot of the science gets brought forward here on what practices will be most advantageous to put in certain places. And it just depends on what your priority interests or concerns are. Those will be different depending on and where you target your activities for implementation. And then finally, what you're going to do to measure your progress. How much improvement will you see if you do all these implementation actions on the landscape? And so this is done a lot of times. The measurement part of it is estimated by using models and tools. And we have got a lot of different choices for models and tools here in Minnesota. Those have been developed. A lot of times, those will be used to estimate the progress that we'll be making if we do these implementation actions. And so this is an example you're just seeing here from the Missouri River One Watershed One Plan on how they've prioritized, targeted, and developed some measurements for progress. Lastly, I'm going to touch on this watershed-based implementation funding. Once the plan has been locally adopted, the partnership is eligible to receive watershed-based implementation funding from the Board of Water and Soil Resources. So this is coordinated again amongst the partnership. So it's locally led collaboration on what you're going to do with the funding. This funding comes from the Clean Water Fund. It requires, the Clean Water Fund requires this funding to be supplemental and to be spent on projects whose primary benefit is water quality. This is in addition to other state funding that is available. So this is again it's another pot that's available for funding. But this funding through the Watershed Basin Implementation Funding Grant is not the only funding that folks should look to implement activities in your plan. It's just one available grant that can be utilized to implement practices. Again, Lewis spoke about the authority that watershed districts have to levy tax funds. Those could also be used to implement activities within the comprehensive watershed management plan. So we strongly encourage the planning groups to look beyond the funding that's available through the state and look to potentially federal funding sources and or nonprofit or other types of funding sources that would be available and applicable to the types of activities that you want to implement. So the intent here is to provide stable and predictable funding for implementing a portion of the actions in your watershed plan. This is also meant to kind of streamline the process for receiving the funds. And this is known support for local government. So again, and we can show that this is being utilized through targeted and prioritized focused activities in your watershed. So again, this is something that's meant to be ongoing and available based on, of course, it depended on legislative appropriation. So that's the intent, and hopefully we continue to receive that funding support. I think I just want to wrap up here again with just this thought that we're not just trying to raise the bar here from the technical perspective of water management. We certainly have a lot more technical science that's available to us, and these models and tools that are available to help us estimate our potential success. But I think that the most important thing to remember is this partnership paradigm switch, where in the past we worked as individual entities, and we certainly did accomplish great things, but together we can accomplish much more through collaboration and coordination, especially when it comes to water resource management. So the ultimate goal here in working through these comprehensive watershed management plans and implementing them is to have these durable partnerships with entities within the watershed to collaborate and cooperate to implement activities that in the end is going to improve or protect the water resources in the watershed so that people can live, work, and play there for generations to come. And I'll stop there. And Kevin, I'm sure you have a lot of great things to add.
Well, just thanks, Annie. Nice summary and overview and getting into the details of the comprehensive watershed management approach. Just a couple things to build on that. I think the first thing, and one of the last slides you showed, is locally led, and I think that's a really key tenet to this approach, and it's sort of the maybe the mantra, if you will, that we've tried to establish, that this approach, the comprehensive watershed management planning, is locally led, state supported. And I think that's a really important thing to keep in mind, is that we want, and we hope that you would want, the state partners to be at the table and serving in an advisory role through providing the data, the science that's available through RAPs, through GRAPs, through TMDL studies, through the DNR data collection, the information that's available that you can then utilize and build into your comprehensive plans to shape where the priorities that you want to work on to achieve water quality. So a really important concept, and that's very true. It's locally led, state supported. It's about what are you as partners locally going to do to achieve water quality improvement, water quality protection within your watershed. I think the other aspect is, and maybe wasn't as explicit in the information that Annie shared, is that this approach does not take away or circumvent any one entity's existing authorities. So as a watershed district, you certainly have a set of authorities that another local unit of government may not have, or a specific set. Maybe there's some regulatory aspects that you're going to take on, or some funding mechanisms and approaches to achieving funding. That doesn't take that away. It doesn't require that you at your watershed district board has to receive approval from the partnership to do that. Certainly you can use those authorities to help implement this plan. We hope that that's sort of the overall arching premise, that you utilize, that the other partners utilize their authorities to help implement the plan. But it doesn't necessarily mean that that's the only thing that's the way things are going to get done. Also recognizing, and Lewis shared on, one of the key things that you have as a watershed district is the ability to levy for capital improvement projects. And sometimes with these plans, with the comprehensive plans, there might be some things very locally specific that are of value and of high priority resource to your individual watershed district and watershed district area that might not rise quite to the highest priority for the overarching watershed. You can still develop, maybe you incorporate it into this plan, but then that gets a little muddied, or you maintain a capital improvement project plan or an annual plan that identifies what are the bigger things that you're going to do. Is there a connection to the comprehensive plan, the partner of watershed comprehensive plan, in terms of the goals and the objectives, but still allowing you to, levy for that project, construct that project without needing to receive approval from the watershed partnership that you're working on. So just a few key considerations there to keep in mind as you're going about this. It's about collaboratively achieving water quality goals, water quality improvement projects and efforts for the whole, and really identifying the strengths of all of the partner entities to achieve that.
Do you have any questions or things that we can discuss a little bit more in depth? I don't see anything in the chat. If you do think of something later on today too, just feel free to pop in the chat. Kevin and I can try to respond back via chat as well.
Yeah, I think as the next session and the role in planning, and then also this afternoon after lunch, when Michelle gets into the details of this, you'll start to get a sense of how this actually works in a local example, and one that's been established for a couple of years. They've gone through both the planning process. They are in the middle of implementing their plan. And so I think Michelle will be able to provide a good perspective of how it works with the partnership as well as within the individual watershed district. So, the details of how this works, I think you'll hear later this morning and this afternoon.
All right. Thank you to Lewis and Kevin and Annie for the presentations this morning. Like they said, if you have questions and you don't want to ask now, the chat is always available. Otherwise, we will sign off for now, and we will start again promptly at 11. Thank you.